The lemonade stand and the shadow of authority. The hot sun burned the asphalt, filling the streets with the thick scent of heated air and blooming acacia trees. The afternoon haze shimmered over the suburban neighborhood, where people walked lazily along the sidewalks, shielding their eyes from the glaring light. Amidst this sweltering heat, a small yet determined figure worked diligently on the corner of Oak Ridge Street. Amara Williams, a bright-eyed black teenager with soft curls tied in a high puff, arranged plastic cups on a makeshift table. The table, an old wooden crate covered with a clean yellow cloth, stood proudly in the shade of a sprawling oak tree. A hand-drawn sign with bold, enthusiastic letters read, "Fresh homemade lemonade, $1." Beside the sign sat a large glass jar filled with ice, fresh-cut lemons, and a bright yellow liquid that sparkled in the sunlight. The simple stand was more than just a summer activity. It was Amara's dream. She wanted to raise enough money for her upcoming school trip, a once-in-a-lifetime educational tour to Washington, D.C., but more than that, she wanted to prove that she could do something on her own, without always depending on her parents. Her mother, Lisa Williams, stood on the front porch, watching with a mix of pride and concern. Dressed in a simple summer dress, she wiped her hands on a dish towel and called out, "We're sure to get a lot of customers today, sweetheart." Amara turned to face her mother with a bright smile. "I know, Mom. I made an extra batch just in case." Lisa nodded approvingly, but couldn't shake off the unease creeping into her chest. The world wasn't always kind, especially to young black girls who dared to dream. But she didn't want to dampen her daughter's enthusiasm, so she simply smiled and waved. Within minutes, the first customers arrived. A young couple with a little girl stopped at the stand, curiosity glinting in their eyes. "Lemonade, huh?" the man said, fishing for his wallet. "Yes, sir. Freshly made, just for $1, Amara said with a grin. The little girl clapped her hands excitedly. "I want one." Amara poured the lemonade with care, handing the child a cup. The girl took a sip, her face lighting up. "Mom, it's really good." The parents chuckled, handing Amara a $5 bill. "Keep the change," the woman said warmly. "Thank you so much." Amara beamed, dropping the bill into her glass jar. The satisfying jingle of coins and cash filled her heart with joy. As more customers arrived, the stand became a lively little hub of conversation and laughter. Neighbors, joggers, and passersby stopped to grab a cup, exchanging smiles and compliments. But a shadow lurked at the corner of the street. Leaning against his patrol car, Officer Gerard Slocum watched the scene with narrowed eyes. His broad, angular face was devoid of warmth as he adjusted his belt, where his baton and handcuffs hung like symbols of silent authority. He clutched his walkie-talkie, his mind already spinning with thoughts. Illegal trade. No permit. They always think they can just do whatever they want. Amara had no way of knowing that behind her laughter and honest labor, a threat was beginning to form. The first confrontation. The soft clinking of change in the jar was music to Amara's ears. Her confidence grew as more people stopped by, enjoying this sweet, tart refreshment. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't notice the heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching. The cheerful buzz of the street quieted as Officer Slocum's imposing figure loomed over the lemonade stand. The sunlight glinted off the badge on his chest, the polished metal reflecting in Amara's wide eyes. "Well, Slocum said, his voice dripping with false amusement. "What do we have here?" Amara looked up, her smile faltering. She had been taught to respect authority, but there was something in the officer's gaze that made her uneasy. "This is my lemonade stand, sir," she replied politely, standing up a little straighter. "I'm just selling lemonade to raise money for my school trip." Slocum smirked, tilting his head slightly. "A school trip, huh?" He glanced at the hand-drawn sign and the jar of money. His expression hardened. "And do you have a permit for this little business of yours?" Amara blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "A permit?" "Yes," he said sharply, his voice growing cold. You can't just set up shop on a public sidewalk without permission. That's called unlicensed vending. It's illegal. Fear gripped Amara's stomach. I didn't know, she stammered. I just thought. Slocum didn't let her finish. That's the problem, isn't it? People like you always think you can just do whatever you want without consequences. People like you. The words hit Amara like a slap. The way he said it, the sneer on his face, it wasn't just about lemonade. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists, trying to keep her composure. That's not true, she said firmly. I just wanted to earn some honest money. Slocum let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. Honest money. He leaned in close enough that Amara could smell his cologne mixed with sweat. You want an honest job. Get a real one. This. He gestured at the lemonade stand with a dismissive flick of his hand. It's illegal. The tension in the air grew thick. The once friendly crowd around her took hesitant steps back, unsure whether to intervene. Even the elderly Mrs. Pearson, who had just praised Amara's lemonade, lowered her gaze and retreated into the background. Amara's heart pounded. Every instinct told her to pack up, to avoid trouble, but something deep inside resisted. Why should I? I'm not doing anything wrong. Sir, please, she tried again. I'm not hurting anyone. Slocum straightened up, pulling out his notepad. Take it down. Now. Amara hesitated. I said, now. His voice cracked like a whip, making her flinch. Silence. Then, the murmurs of the crowd. Someone pulled out their phone and started recording. Amara swallowed hard. Her mother's words echoed in her head. Keep your head high. No matter what. I'm not taking it down, she said, lifting her chin defiantly. A flicker of surprise flashed in Slocum's eyes before they darkened. Oh, so you're resisting. He took a step closer, his hand moving toward the handcuffs on his belt. I guess I'll have to teach you a little respect for the law. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. The onlookers watched in horror as the officer reached for Amara. Fear surged through her, but so did something else. Anger. This isn't right. This isn't fair. Her entire body tensed as the officer's shadow loomed over her. Then, just as his hand closed around the cuffs, a voice rang out, sharp, commanding, and furious. Get your hands off my daughter. The crowd turned, parting like waves. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an impeccable suit strode toward them, his expression thunderous. Amara's heart leaped with relief. Her father, Daniel Williams, the city's district attorney, had arrived. And he was furious. A father's fury, a system's betrayal. The street had never been so silent. Daniel Williams, district attorney, respected prosecutor, and most importantly, Amara's father, stepped through the crowd like a storm ready to wreak havoc. His sharp suit, normally a symbol of his professionalism, now looked like the armor of a warrior stepping into battle. His voice, cold and unwavering, rang out again. I said, get your hands off my daughter. Officer Gerard Slocum turned, his hand still hovering over his cuffs. His jaw tightened when he saw who had spoken. Daniel Williams, a name well known in the legal world. A man with power. The crowd parted further, sensing that something monumental was about to happen. Phones were raised, their cameras recording every second. Slocum straightened, his smirk twitching. Mr. Williams, I suggest you step back. This is police business. Daniel stopped just inches from the officer, his piercing brown eyes locked onto the man in uniform. He was calm, but his presence alone carried more authority than any badge ever could. Police business. Daniel's voice was dangerously quiet. You mean harassing and attempting to arrest a child for selling lemonade? She's vending without a permit. Slocum snapped. That's against the law. Daniel's gaze flickered to his daughter, still standing behind her small lemonade stand, her hands clenched into fists. He could see the tears she refused to shed, the defiance she refused to let die. The pain in her eyes burned something deep inside him. Taking a slow breath, He turned back to Slocum, his voice like steel. "You mean to tell me that my 12-year-old daughter, selling homemade lemonade on a quiet street, is such a threat to society that it justifies you attempting to put her in handcuffs?" Slocum didn't back down, though his confidence wavered under the weight of Daniel's words. "The law applies to everyone, Mr. Williams. No exceptions." Daniel chuckled humorlessly, shaking his head. "Oh, I agree. The law should apply to everyone, including corrupt, power-hungry officers who think they can terrorize little girls under the guise of law enforcement." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone in the back yelled, "Yeah, she's just a kid." Slocum's patience was wearing thin. His grip on his baton tightened. "This isn't about race," he muttered, his lips curling into a sneer. "This is about order." Daniel's expression darkened. "Oh, I think we both know exactly what this is about." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Let me ask you something, Officer Slocum. If my daughter were white, would you be standing here right now? Would you be reaching for those cuffs? Would you be trying to make her feel like a criminal?" A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Slocum's face twitched. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to explain myself to you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You do when you're violating a minor's civil rights in front of half the neighborhood." Slocum's arrogance cracked. He looked around, realizing just how many people were watching. His smirk vanished. His grip loosened. Daniel saw his chance. "Take your hands off her." Slocum hesitated, but the murmurs in the crowd grew louder, their voices filled with anger. The pressure was mounting. And then, click. With a sharp, reluctant movement, Slocum unclipped the cuffs from his belt and stepped back. Amara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Daniel stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm, reassuring. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The system strikes back. The scene should have ended there. Slocum should have walked away, realizing that he'd made a mistake. But men like him never admitted they were wrong. Instead, he reached for his radio. "This is Officer Slocum requesting backup at Oak Ridge Street. Over." The crowd's anger turned into stunned silence. Daniel's body tensed. "Backup? Are you serious?" Slocum's smug expression returned. "You just interfered with police business, Mr. Williams." He gestured to Amara's lemonade stand. "This is illegal trade. You're obstructing an officer from upholding the law." Daniel let out a sharp laugh, his patience wearing thin. "You're seriously calling for backup over a lemonade stand?" Slocum smirked. "If you're so sure I'm in the wrong, Mr. District Attorney, why don't we let the station handle it?" And just like that, the sound of sirens filled the air. A second patrol car rolled up. Then a third. 3 officers stepped out, their hands resting near their holsters, eyes scanning the crowd. The tension thickened. Lisa Williams, Amara's mother, had just stepped out onto the porch when she saw the growing police presence. Her face paled. "Daniel," she called, her voice tight with fear. Daniel turned slightly, giving her a look that said, "I have this under control." But deep down, he knew control was slipping. Because this wasn't just about Amara anymore. This was about power. The arrest. One of the new officers approached, a tall man with graying hair and weary eyes. He glanced at Slocum, then at Daniel. "What's going on here?" he asked, clearly confused by the scene. Slocum straightened his back. "This girl was selling lemonade without a permit. When I attempted to shut it down, her father, Daniel Williams, interfered with law enforcement." The officer blinked. His eyes flickered to Daniel, recognition dawning in them. "The Daniel Williams?" he asked, clearly uneasy. Slocum nodded, smirking. The gray-haired officer sighed, rubbing his temple. He looked at the lemonade stand, at Amara, at the dozens of phones still recording. He looked at Daniel, whose face was carved from stone. Then, as if this couldn't get any worse, Slocum dropped the bomb. I'm pressing charges against both of them. The girl for illegal vending, her father for obstructing police business. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Lisa's voice cracked. You can't do this. Daniel inhaled deeply, his fists clenching. He could fight this. He knew he could. But the rage boiling in his chest made him want to do more than fight. He wanted to tear the system apart. The gray-haired officer hesitated. Gerard. Slocum cut him off. Arrest them both. Daniel instinctively stepped in front of Amara. You will not put your hands on my daughter. Slocum's smirk widened. Then you can come with us willingly, or we can do this the hard way. Lisa ran down the porch, grabbing Amara's hand. You are not taking my baby. The officers moved in. Phones captured everything. And in that moment, as Daniel felt the cold metal of handcuffs tighten around his wrists, he knew. This was no longer just a fight for his daughter. This was a fight for justice itself. A caged lion and a city on fire. The cold bite of metal around his wrists was like a slap in the face. The hum of the street, the gasps of the crowd, the furious shouts of his wife, all of it blurred as Daniel Williams stood with his hands cuffed behind his back. It was surreal. A nightmare. A moment he never thought would happen to him. Not like this. But here he was. His daughter, a child, stood frozen in front of him. Her small wrists shackled in cuffs meant for criminals. Her wide, fearful eyes met his, and that's when it hit him. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a warning. Officer Gerard Slocum had a smirk plastered across his smug face, arms crossed as if savoring every moment. Daniel clenched his jaw. This bastard is enjoying this. Slocum turned to the crowd, addressing them like a self-righteous king delivering a decree. Let this be a lesson to all of you. His voice carried through the street. The law applies to everyone, no matter who they are. Lies. Daniel's nostrils flared as he stared him down. You mean the law applies to everyone who looks like us, he said coldly. A murmur ran through the crowd. A woman in a floral dress yelled, "This ain't right." A man in a hoodie held up his phone, streaming live. They're arresting a little girl for selling lemonade. Y'all seeing this? Slocum's eyes darted to the phones recording him. A flash of uncertainty passed over his face, but it was gone in an instant. Take them both to the station, he snapped at the officers. Lisa lunged forward. No, you can't do this. One of the older officers, the one with the graying hair and weary eyes, hesitated. He looked at Lisa, at the girl in cuffs, at the man beside her, the district attorney. Gerard, he muttered under his breath. This is a bad idea. Slocum's eyes narrowed. You have a problem, Henry. The older officer clenched his jaw, but didn't reply. Slocum's smirk returned. Didn't think so. Get them in the car. Daniel locked eyes with Lisa. Call Marcus. Lisa, her face streaked with rage and helplessness, nodded quickly. She already had her phone in her hand. Marcus Ridge, defense attorney, Daniel's closest friend, a man who had dragged cops like Slocum through court and won. As Daniel and Amara were dragged toward the patrol car, he took one last look at the crowd, at the cameras pointed at Slocum's face, at the anger in the people's eyes, at the fire this moment had just ignited. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The holding cell, the inside of the station, was a stark contrast to the sunlit street. The air smelled like sweat, coffee, and cheap authority. The fluorescent lights flickered above them, buzzing like dying insects. Amara sat on a cold metal bench in a juvenile holding cell, her arms wrapped around herself. Daniel sat beside her. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating, because he knew exactly what this was. Slocum wanted to humiliate him, wanted to show that no amount of power, no amount of legal knowledge, could stop the system when it decided to break you. But Slocum made a mistake. He messed with the wrong damn family. The heavy clunk of boots against the tiled floor made them both look up. Slocum. He strolled toward the cell, his badge gleaming under the buzzing lights, his smirk still infuriatingly intact. Daniel exhaled through his nose, keeping his expression unreadable. "Hope the accommodations are to your liking," Slocum said mockingly, crossing his arms. Daniel leaned back against the cold wall, feigning ease. "Is this where you bring all the dangerous criminals selling lemonade?" Slocum chuckled. "Just the ones who think the law doesn't apply to them." Daniel's gaze darkened. "The law? Or your personal vendetta?" Slocum's smirk twitched, but he didn't falter. "You're in no position to be asking questions, Williams. You and your daughter broke the law. Plain and simple." Amara, silent until now, suddenly sat up straighter. Her voice was soft but sharp as a blade. "Then why did you only arrest me and not all the other kids selling lemonade in this town?" Slocum's face twitched, just slightly, but Daniel saw it. Slocum opened his mouth, but Amara wasn't done. "Because they're white?" she asked. A loaded silence filled the space between them. Daniel's lips curled into a smirk of his own. "That's my girl." Slocum scoffed, shaking his head. "You really think playing the victim will get you out of this?" "No," Daniel said calmly. "But the video of you arresting a 12-year-old for selling lemonade, that might." Slocum's eyes darkened, because he knew exactly what Daniel meant. The video goes viral. By the time Daniel and Amara were processed, the video had already taken on a life of its own. News stations ran the footage on a loop. "Districtatorney and DAUGHERARESTED for selling lemonade. Video of officier ARESTING 12-year-old East PR case. Outrage. TALSFOR INVESTIGATION into POLICEMISCONDUCT." Social media exploded. The hashtags #Justice for Amara and #Free Amara trended worldwide. Hundreds, then thousands, then millions of people shared the footage. Celebrities spoke out. Politicians were forced to comment. And in front of the police station, protesters gathered. Hundreds of them, holding signs, chanting, demanding answers. Lisa stood at the front, rage in her stance, power in her voice as she spoke into a reporter's microphone. "My daughter is not a criminal, and the officer who put her in cuffs will answer for it." Inside the station, Daniel sat calmly in the holding cell. Because he knew the system, and he knew exactly how to turn it against the men who thought they could break him. The release, and the battle ahead. 30 minutes later, an officer, not Slocum, unlocked their cell. "You're free to go," the man muttered, eyes avoiding Daniel's. Daniel stood slowly, stretching his wrists. "What?" No apology. The officer's jaw tightened. The charges were dropped. Of course they were. The department was in damage control mode now. As they walked out, Amara clutched her father's hand tightly. The moment they stepped through the doors, the roar of the crowd outside hit them like a wave. Flashes of cameras, reporters shoving microphones forward, protesters cheering their names. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Marcus Ridge. Lisa rushed forward, hugging her daughter tightly, whispering promises that everything would be okay. Marcus smirked at Daniel. "I assume you're ready to tear them apart." Daniel buttoned his cuffs, rolling his shoulders. "Oh," he said, eyes gleaming. "You have no idea." The lawsuit that shook the city. The moment Daniel Williams and Amara stepped out of the police station, the entire city erupted. The flashing lights of cameras, the deafening chants of protesters, and the relentless swarm of reporters converged on them like a tidal wave. Lisa rushed forward, pulling Amara into her arms. "Baby, are you okay?" she whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. Amara held onto her mother tightly, but kept her chin high. "I'm okay, Mom," she said, her voice steady despite everything. Daniel, however, was already calculating his next move. Beside him, Marcus Ridge, his best friend, and one of the top defense attorneys in the state smirked. "You ready to make history?" Marcus asked, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. Daniel's eyes burned with cold, controlled fury. "I'm ready to burn their entire system to the ground." The lawsuit begins. That very night, Daniel and Marcus worked late into the morning, drafting one of the most aggressive civil rights lawsuits the city had ever seen. Williams versus City of Brookhaven Police Department. The charges: wrongful arrest, excessive use of force, violation of a minor's civil rights, racial discrimination, abuse of power. The evidence: the viral video of Officer Slocum arresting a 12-year-old girl, eyewitness testimony from the people at the lemonade stand, proof that dozens of other lemonade stands, operated by white children, had never been shut down, a history of complaints against Officer Slocum for misconduct. The damages: $10 million in compensatory damages, a demand for Officer Slocum's termination, a call for police reform within the department. By morning, the case had been filed. By noon, the media had their hands on it. By nightfall, the mayor's office was in full crisis mode. The city's response: the Brookhaven Police Department tried to fight back. At a hastily arranged press conference, the police chief stood behind a podium, his face tight with barely concealed tension. This was not about race, he claimed. Officer Slocum was merely enforcing the law. This situation has been exaggerated by social media. Daniel watched the broadcast from his home, sitting beside Marcus and Lisa. Exaggerated. Lisa scoffed, shaking her head. "That man put handcuffs on my baby in front of a crowd." Marcus smirked. "They're panicking." Daniel's jaw clenched. Not enough. Not yet. Then, the chief made a fatal mistake. "Officer Slocum remains on duty," he announced, "and we stand by his actions." Silence filled the Williams living room. Marcus slowly leaned forward. "Tell me you just heard that." Daniel inhaled deeply. "Oh, I heard it." Lisa stood, rage burning in her chest. "So they don't even care, after everything." Daniel exhaled. "They care. They just think we'll back down." Lisa crossed her arms. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." Daniel grinned. "Exactly. The protest that changed everything." The next day, the streets outside City Hall were flooded with protesters. Over 10,000 people gathered, demanding justice for Amara. Activists, lawyers, teachers, parents, students holding signs that read "Lemonade isn't a crime." News stations covered it nonstop. Brookhaven is facing one of the largest civil rights protests in state history, a reporter announced. A camera zoomed in on a powerful sight: Amara herself, standing at the front of the march, holding her mother's hand. Microphones were shoved toward her. "Amara, what do you want to say to the police?" a journalist asked. She paused, then lifted her head. "I just want to know," she said softly, her voice steady, "why they think a girl like me doesn't deserve the same chances as everyone else." The crowd erupted in cheers. Lisa wiped a tear from her cheek. Daniel watched his daughter turning into something more than just a victim. She was becoming a symbol. The police start to crack. Inside the Brookhaven Police Department, panic was setting in. The mayor had called an emergency meeting. Slocum sat in the chief's office, arms crossed, still smirking. "They won't win," he muttered. The chief wasn't so sure. "They don't have to win. They just have to make us look bad." "Sir," another officer interrupted, showing a news broadcast on his phone. "There's a petition demanding Slocum be fired." The chief sighed. "How many signatures?" The officer hesitated. "Sir, it passed 1 million." Slocum's smirk vanished. The chief rubbed his face. "Damn it." Another officer burst into the room. "Sir, the governor just called." The chief's stomach dropped. "What did he say?" The officer swallowed hard. "He said fix this now, or you're both fired." The courtroom showdown. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit reached court. Packed. Televised. The entire nation watching. On one side, Daniel and Marcus, dressed sharp as blades, preparing to slice through the police department's lies. On the other side, Officer Slocum, arms crossed, still convinced he was untouchable. The first witness, an elderly woman, the one who had been there that day. "I saw it all," she said firmly. "That officer grabbed that child like she was a criminal. It was wrong." Next, the viral video played in the courtroom. The audience gasped. The judge frowned. Daniel stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Now it was time to finish this. He walked toward the stand, looking directly at Slocum. "Officer," Daniel said, "can you tell us why you chose to arrest my daughter?" Slocum sneered. "She was breaking the law." Daniel nodded. "Aha. Can you explain why, out of dozens of lemonade stands that day, you only shut hers down?" Slocum hesitated. "I was just doing my job." Daniel pounced. "Your job? Is that why we have multiple complaints against you for racial profiling? Is that why we found 0 records of you ever shutting down a white child's lemonade stand?" Slocum shifted uncomfortably. Daniel stepped closer. "You abused your power. You humiliated a child. And now you're paying the price." The tension in the room was electric. Then the judge leaned forward. "Officer Slocum," he said, voice heavy with meaning, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Silence. For the first time, Slocum had nothing to say. Daniel smiled. "I rest my case." The verdict that shook the nation. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, filled to the brim with reporters, activists, and legal experts. Cameras from every major news network were fixed on the proceedings, broadcasting the case across the nation. People everywhere, from politicians to blue-collar workers, from college students to celebrities, were waiting for one thing. Would justice finally be served? Would the American legal system, which had so often failed people who looked like Amara, finally hold one of its own accountable? Or would Officer Slocum walk away with nothing but a slap on the wrist? Daniel Williams knew the stakes, and he wasn't about to let his daughter's future be decided by a system that had ignored so many before her. The final cross-examination. Daniel takes his shot. Daniel stood from his seat at the prosecution table, his black suit crisp, his eyes sharp like a predator circling its prey. Across the room, Officer Gerard Slocum sat on the witness stand, his arrogance starting to crack. His arms were crossed, his expression hardened, but his leg bounced slightly, a small but undeniable sign that he was nervous. "Good." Daniel approached slowly, each step deliberate. "Officer Slocum," he said, his voice steady, "let's go over your actions one more time." Slocum exhaled sharply, already irritated. "I already answered your questions." Daniel smirked. "I know. But see, I'm not quite convinced yet. Maybe you can help me understand. Let's start with the basics. You say Amara was breaking the law." "Correct." Slocum nodded stiffly. "Yes, she was vending without a permit. That's illegal." Daniel tilted his head, as if considering the point. "Okay. Now, can you tell me why, out of the dozens of lemonade stands that day, you only shut down hers?" Slocum's jaw tightened. "I was doing my job." Daniel smirked. "Your job? Oh, so your job was to skip over every white kid selling lemonade and go straight for the black girl." Slocum visibly stiffened. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel. "Order." Slocum forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. "That's ridiculous. This had nothing to do with race." Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice now dangerously quiet. "Then explain this." He lifted a stack of papers and slammed them onto the evidence table. The courtroom fell silent. "This is a compiled report of every street vendor shut down in Brookhaven over the last 5 years," Daniel announced. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I submit this as Exhibit F?" The judge peered at him, then at the documents. "Proceed." Daniel picked up the report, flipping a page. According to these records, Officer Slocum has issued 43 citations for vending without a permit over the last 5 years. He paused, then turned to face Slocum. Out of those 43, 39 of them were given to Black or Latino vendors. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Slocum's face drained of color. Daniel continued, his voice like a sharpened blade. "So, Officer Slocum, I ask again, was this really about the law?" Slocum swallowed hard, but remained silent. Daniel took another step closer. "Or was this about something else?" Slocum glared at him. "You're twisting this." Daniel held up a hand. "Oh no, I'm clarifying this. Let's be clear, you didn't just stop my daughter. You tried to break her." Daniel turned to the jury. This officer didn't just see a lemonade stand. He saw a black girl who dared to believe she had the right to stand there. And that made him mad. He turned back to Slocum. "You put your hands on a child. Officer, you humiliated her. You treated her like she was a criminal." His voice dropped lower, filled with quiet fury. "You arrested her like she was dangerous." Daniel's gaze hardened. "She's 12, and she's my daughter." Silence. Raw, suffocating silence. Daniel straightened his suit. "No further questions, Your Honor." The closing arguments. The police attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair, tried to salvage what was left of the department's reputation. "This lawsuit is nothing but an attempt to villainize a good officer for doing his job," he argued. But his words felt weak. Because the jury had already seen the truth, and when Daniel stepped forward to deliver his final words, the entire courtroom leaned in. "My daughter was arrested over a cup of lemonade." His voice was strong, but beneath it was pain. He looked at the jury, making sure they felt what he felt. What happened that day was not about law enforcement. It was about power, and how some people abuse it against those they think are too weak to fight back. He turned, locking eyes with every juror. "But today, you have the chance to say, no more." A pause. Then, "Find in our favor, and show every child in this country that they don't have to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them." He exhaled slowly. "Thank you." Then he sat down and waited. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. And then they returned. The courtroom held its breath as the judge read the verdict. On the charges of wrongful arrest, guilty. A ripple of excitement ran through the room. On the charges of excessive use of force against a minor, guilty. A louder reaction. Slocum's face was stone, his hands gripping the table. On the charges of racial discrimination, guilty. Then came the final blow. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom exploded. Lisa burst into tears, hugging Amara tightly. Marcus let out a low whistle, shaking his head in victory. And Daniel sat there, silent, watching as justice finally caught up to the man who tried to break his daughter. Officer Slocum's face twisted in rage as he stood abruptly. "This is bull." "Enough, Officer Slocum," the judge snapped, banging his gavel. "You are hereby dismissed from duty, stripped of your pension, and sentenced to 6 months in federal detention." Slocum's smug grin was gone, replaced with pure, unfiltered fear. Daniel met his gaze and smirked. The city reacts. The nation erupted. Brookhaven Police Department was forced to launch a full internal investigation. The mayor fired the chief of police. Daniel and Marcus became national figures in the fight for police reform. And Amara became a voice for change. She was invited to speak at rallies, colleges, even Congress, because she wasn't just the girl who sold lemonade. She was the girl who stood up to the system and won. The revolution that started with lemonade. 1 month after the verdict, the city of Brookhaven had changed forever. Officer Gerard Slocum, once untouchable, now sat in a 6 by 8 foot federal prison cell. His badge, gone. His career over. His pension revoked. The police department was in shambles. The mayor had fired the police chief, and the entire nation was watching, demanding more. But the real change, it wasn't happening in the courtroom. It was happening in the streets. The rise of the lemonade revolution. It started small. A little girl in Atlanta set up a lemonade stand with a sign that read, "For Amara." Then a group of kids in Chicago did the same. Then a school in Los Angeles. Then a park in Houston. Then a protest in New York City. Soon, across every major city in America, kids of all backgrounds, Black, Latino, white, Asian, indigenous, set up lemonade stands as a symbol of peaceful protest. The message was clear. Kids should never be afraid of the police. Justice should be the same for everyone. Power should never be used to oppress. By the end of the month, over 100,000 lemonade stands had been set up across all 50 states, and the media couldn't ignore it. The Lemonade Revolution, the headlines called it. Reporters swarmed the Williams home, cameras rolling as Amara sat at her own lemonade stand in their front yard, pouring cups for free. When a journalist asked her, "How does it feel to inspire all of this?" Amara just smiled and said, "I just wanted to sell lemonade. But if this helps make things better, then I'm happy." The crowd cheered. But the fight, it wasn't over. Daniel Williams goes to war. Daniel sat in a conference room in Washington, D.C., surrounded by civil rights attorneys, politicians, and activists. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is just the beginning." The viral movement had forced Congress to act. Legislators were now rushing to introduce a nationwide bill that would ban police officers from detaining minors for nonviolent infractions, mandate body cameras for all law enforcement officers, require annual racial bias training for police departments, create an independent review board for police misconduct cases. Daniel tapped his pen against the table. "We are no longer asking for justice. We're demanding it." And for the first time in his legal career, Congress was listening. Slocum's last stand. Meanwhile, inside a federal prison, Gerard Slocum stewed in rage. He had gone from patrolling the streets to sleeping in a concrete box. His cellmates knew his face. They knew why he was there. And they didn't respect him. One day, a fellow inmate shoved him against a wall in the cafeteria. "You ain't so tough now, huh, cop?" Slocum gritted his teeth, but he said nothing. Because he knew. He was nobody now. And outside these walls, the world had moved on without him. The governor calls for change. 2 months after the verdict, the governor of Georgia stood at a podium, delivering a historic speech. "We have failed," he admitted, his voice serious. "And today we begin to make it right." The Brookhaven Police Department was officially under federal oversight. New rules were introduced to prevent racial profiling. New leadership was brought in. Mandatory police de-escalation training was passed into law. It was the biggest police reform in the state's history, and the Williams family, they were sitting front row, watching it happen. When the governor finished, he turned to Amara. "This change started because of you," he told her. "Never stop fighting." The final interview. 6 months later, Amara sat in a CNN studio for her first live national interview. The anchor smiled. "Amara, you've become a symbol of hope. What do you want to say to the world?" Amara thought for a moment. Then she spoke. "I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to sell lemonade." She paused. "But when bad things happen, we have 2 choices. We can either stay quiet or we can speak up. I chose to speak up." She looked straight into the camera. "And if you ever feel like something is unfair, you should speak up too." The anchor blinked, visibly moved. The audience erupted in applause. And just like that, Amara Williams became a voice for an entire generation. Epilogue. A new beginning. 1 year later, Amara sat in a high school classroom. flipping through her history book. Her teacher stood at the front of the room, pointing to a brand new section of the textbook. The Lemonade Revolution, the movement that changed America. Amara's own face was in the pages. Her jaw dropped. Wait, this is in the curriculum now. The teacher smiled. It sure is. The entire class turned to stare at her. One boy grinned. Yo, Amara, you're literally in the history books now. Amara's cheeks flushed. But as she looked at the words on the page, she realized this fight wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the world. She closed the book, a small smile playing at her lips. Then she reached for her notebook, picked up her pen, and started writing the next chapter. The future we built. 1 year later, Brookhaven was no longer the same city. The courthouse, the police station, even City Hall, they all looked different. Not because of new buildings or renovations, because of the people, because of change. The protests had ended, but the movement hadn't. The Lemonade Revolution had grown into something much bigger, a nationwide call to action. And at the center of it all, Amara Williams, the laws named after her. It was official. The Amara Law was passed statewide. It made it illegal for police officers to detain or arrest minors for nonviolent infractions like vending without a permit. The Slocum Clause was added to police training. Officers were now required to complete racial bias training every year, with independent oversight. A new oversight board was created, making sure police officers couldn't police themselves anymore. And the most important law, Amara's right to stand, a federal law that prevented racial profiling in petty law enforcement interactions. Daniel Williams had fought like hell to make sure it passed, and he had won. The awards and recognition. When Amara stepped on stage at the NAACP Awards, she never thought she'd be standing next to some of the most influential leaders in the country. But here she was. The host smiled at her. Amara, before we give you this award, we want to ask, how does it feel to be a symbol for change? Amara took the microphone. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she took a deep breath and said, I don't feel like a symbol. I feel like a girl who wanted to sell lemonade and got arrested for it. The crowd laughed softly. Amara continued, but if my story made people realize something is wrong, then I'll keep speaking up. A standing ovation filled the room. The plaque she received that night, it would sit right next to her lemonade stand sign at home. Because she never wanted to forget where it all started. Gerard Slocum, the man who lost everything. In a cheap motel on the outskirts of Atlanta, a disgraced ex-cop sat on a stained mattress, flipping through TV channels. Slocum looked different. His smug arrogance gone. His confidence shattered. The world had moved on without him. And now, all he had left was a criminal record, a mountain of debt, and a name that nobody respected anymore. He had applied for private security jobs, denied. He had tried to get reinstated in another town, rejected. He had even sued for wrongful termination, lost. Now, he was a nobody, and it was all because of a little girl selling lemonade. For the first time in his life, Slocum understood something. Power isn't permanent. If you abuse it, it gets taken away. He had taken something from Amara Williams that day, and she had taken everything from him in return. Amara's next step, a dream realized. As the world continued to change around her, Amara never stopped being Amara. She still went to school. She still hung out with her friends. She still dreamed. And one of those dreams was coming true. The day she had been waiting for finally arrived. Her parents stood beside her as she clutched the acceptance letter from Howard University. Lisa sniffled, wiping away tears. I can't believe it, baby. Marcus clapped Daniel on the back. Your girl's going to law school, man. Daniel, who had spent years fighting other people's battles, had to fight to keep his own voice steady. I'm just so damn proud of you, sweetheart. Amara grinned. I mean, I did have a pretty good role model." She nudged him playfully. Dangle chuckled, wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. Howard Law School had offered her a full-ride scholarship, not just because of her activism, but because of her passion for justice. Amara had seen firsthand what injustice looked like, and she wanted to make sure no other child would ever have to feel it again. Her dream was simple: to become a civil rights lawyer, to fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, and maybe, just maybe, to become the kind of prosecutor who made the system better. The final scene. A return to the stand. One last time, before she left for college, Amara set up her lemonade stand. The same wooden crate, the same bright yellow cloth, the same hand-painted sign. But this time, something was different. Instead of one little girl sitting behind the stand, there were hundreds of people lining up to support her. People who had once been silent now stood proudly in solidarity. Lisa handed her a cup. "Go on, baby." Amara took a deep breath and raised her lemonade into the air. The crowd erupted into applause. She took a sip, smiling, because this time, she had already won. Epilogue. A letter to the future. The night before leaving for college, Amara sat at her desk, writing a letter to herself. She didn't know if she'd open it in 5 years or 10, but she wanted to remember this moment. Dear future Amara, if you're reading this, you made it. But I hope you never forget what got you here. I hope you never forget the little girl who just wanted to sell lemonade. I hope you never forget the way they tried to silence you, and how you refused to stay quiet. I hope you never forget that the world doesn't change overnight. But it does change. You proved that. So, no matter what happens next, never stop speaking up. Never stop fighting for what's right. And never stop believing that one voice can make a difference. Because, in the end, that's how revolutions start. With something as simple as lemonade. With love. Past Amara.